The day I found out a homeowners association had towed my truck off my own property was the day I stopped treating them like annoying neighbors and started treating them like a problem that needed solving. The funny thing is, if they'd just left my truck alone, none of what happened afterward would have happened. Not the surveys, not the lawyers, not the panic, and definitely not the check they ended up writing me months later. I live on a 5-acre piece of land outside a small town in western Tennessee, a place my grandfather bought back when nobody wanted it because it was mostly scrub trees, clay soil, and a winding dirt road leading nowhere. Over the years, that dirt road became pavement, farms became subdivisions, and eventually a developer showed up and built a neat little HOA neighborhood behind my property. Nice houses, matching mailboxes, fancy entrance sign, the whole thing. I never had any issue with the people who lived there. Most of them seemed decent enough. My issue was always with the board. More specifically, a woman named Diane Mercer, the HOA president, who carried herself like she had personally been appointed governor of the county. Diane had a habit of treating anything she could see as something she controlled. If a tree branch leaned over a fence, she had opinions. If somebody painted a shed the wrong shade of brown, she had opinions. If kids rode bikes too fast, somehow she had opinions about that too. Fortunately, I wasn't part of the HOA, so most of her opinions weren't my problem. Or at least they weren't supposed to be. My work truck sat on a gravel pad beside my barn. Same truck, same spot, year after year. Every morning I'd walk out with a cup of coffee, toss my tools in the back, and head to work. It wasn't pretty, but it ran. To me it was just a truck. To Diane, apparently, it was a personal insult. Looking back, I realized there had been warning signs. A couple of months before everything happened, she stopped while I was repairing a fence and asked if I planned to store that commercial vehicle there permanently. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She told me the truck lowered property values for her residents. I remember saying, "Well, that's unfortunate, because it's not your property." She didn't like that answer. Not one bit. A few weeks later she showed up again with a clipboard. Nobody carrying a clipboard has ever brought good news. She stood near my fence and informed me that several residents had complained. I asked which residents. She couldn't name any. Then she told me there were standards in civilized communities. I looked around at my land, my barn, my fence, my truck, and finally looked back at her and said, "Good thing I don't live in your community then." That conversation ended exactly as well as you'd expect. Still, I didn't think much of it. People like Diane were always looking for something to complain about. Then one Thursday afternoon, I came home from a long job replacing storm-damaged roofing panels and immediately noticed something wrong. The gravel pad was empty. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I actually stood there staring at the spot where my truck should have been. Then I walked around the barn. Then I checked behind the equipment shed. Then I checked again because sometimes your brain refuses to accept something obvious. The truck was gone. My first thought was theft. I called the sheriff's office. The deputy who answered looked up the plate number and said, "Looks like it wasn't stolen. Looks like it was towed." Towed. I remember repeating that word because it made absolutely no sense. Who in the world tows a vehicle off private property without permission? The answer arrived about 10 minutes later. The towing company told me they had received authorization from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. According to the paperwork, my truck had been classified as an abandoned vehicle sitting on community property. Community property. I actually laughed when they said it because the alternative was putting my fist through a wall. My truck wasn't on community property. It wasn't near community property. It was parked exactly where it had been parked for years. But laughing stopped being funny when I had to hand over $380 to get it back. I drove home furious, but it wasn't really about the money. $380 wasn't going to ruin me. What bothered me was the arrogance. Somebody had looked at my land, decided it belonged to them, and acted on that belief. That kind of confidence doesn't come from ignorance. It comes from never being challenged. That night I dug through old property records my father had left behind. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office. Then I called a licensed surveyor named Travis Cole, a guy with a reputation for being painfully thorough. I told him I wanted a fresh boundary survey. He asked why. I explained the towing incident. He chuckled and said, "Well, if somebody's towing vehicles off your property, I'd say it's worth checking." 3 days later, Travis was walking my property with GPS equipment and old plats spread across the hood of his truck. At first, everything looked routine. Then I noticed him stopping repeatedly near the rear boundary line that touched the HOA neighborhood. He kept checking measurements, then checking them again. By late afternoon, he looked less confused and more interested. The next morning, my phone rang. Travis didn't sound concerned. He sounded excited. And when a surveyor sounds excited, somebody is about to have a very bad day. "Jake," he said, "I think you'd better come take a look at this." I remember sitting in my truck with the phone pressed against my ear, listening to Travis tell me to get over there as soon as I could. The thing about surveyors is they aren't exactly known for dramatic personalities. Most of them are methodical, calm, and about as excitable as a fence post. So when Travis sounded like a kid who had just discovered buried treasure, I knew something unusual was waiting for me. 20 minutes later, I pulled onto the back section of my property, where he had several stakes planted in the ground and a stack of maps spread across the tailgate of his truck. Before I could even ask what was going on, he handed me a survey marker map and said, "Tell me where you think your property line is." I pointed toward the edge of the HOA neighborhood. He nodded. Then he pointed farther in. "It's actually there." At first I thought he was joking. Then he showed me the measurements. Then he showed me the original county records. Then he showed me the GPS verification. Then he showed me a second calculation he had done just to make sure the first one wasn't wrong. Every single document pointed to the exact same conclusion. The circular turnaround at the end of the HOA road extended 11 feet onto my property. Not 11 inches. 11 feet. I just stood there staring at the papers. The turnaround wasn't some decorative landscaping feature. It was the entire cul-de-sac. Every resident at the end of that neighborhood used it every day. School buses used it. Garbage trucks used it. Delivery vans used it. Emergency vehicles used it. For 15 years, people had been driving across my land without knowing it. The developer who built the subdivision had apparently made a surveying error during construction, and nobody had ever caught it. Travis actually laughed and said, "I've seen property line mistakes before, but this one is impressive." The strangest part was that I wasn't excited at first. I was confused, then annoyed, then strangely amused, because suddenly that towing bill sitting on my kitchen counter looked a lot different. Diane and the HOA board had just paid to remove my truck from property that they didn't even fully control. The irony was almost too perfect. Over the next week, I dug deeper. I hired a real estate attorney named Martin Reeves. Martin reviewed the survey, pulled county records, checked permits, and examined the original development filings. His conclusion matched Travis's exactly. The encroachment was real. Worse for the HOA, there was no recorded easement, no agreement, no legal right to use that section of land. The developer had simply built the turnaround in the wrong place, and everyone had been operating under that mistake ever since. When Martin finished reviewing everything, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You know," he said, "they probably should have left your truck alone." That might have been the understatement of the year. At that point, I had a choice. I could ignore the whole thing and move on with life, or I could address the issue properly. I wasn't interested in revenge. At least not yet. What I wanted was accountability. I wanted the people who had treated my property like their own to understand exactly where the boundaries were. So Martin drafted a formal notice. We sent copies to the HOA board, their management company, and their attorney. The letter explained the encroachment, included the certified survey, and requested immediate discussions regarding unauthorized use of my property. Then we waited. 1 week passed. Nothing. 2 weeks passed. Still nothing. Not even an acknowledgement. It was honestly impressive. They had received documents showing that part of their road sat on someone else's land, and their strategy appeared to be pretending reality didn't exist. Martin called their attorney. No response. Emails disappeared into a black hole. Certified letters were signed for and ignored. Eventually, Martin looked at me and said, "Well, if they won't engage, you're under no obligation to continue allowing trespass." That's when the idea of the bollards came up. Everything was legal. Everything was precise. Everything would be installed exactly on my side of the certified property line. No aggression. No damage. No threats. Just a very visible reminder that property ownership still meant something. 3 days later, a contractor arrived with equipment and several heavy concrete bollards. The crew followed the survey markers exactly. I watched from my barn as they worked. By sunset, a neat row of concrete barriers stood along the edge of my land. Technically, nothing dramatic had happened. Legally speaking, I had simply marked my property. Practically speaking, however, An entire neighborhood was about to discover how much they depended on 11 feet of somebody else's land. The first signs appeared the next morning. A delivery van entered the cul-de-sac and couldn't complete its turn. The driver had to back up awkwardly while several residents watched. Around lunchtime, I heard horns. Later that afternoon, I saw a landscaping trailer struggle to maneuver out of the dead-end street. By evening, the neighborhood Facebook group was apparently exploding with complaints. The next morning, things got worse. A school bus driver attempted the turnaround, realized there wasn't enough room, and had to reverse while parents stood outside staring in confusion. By the third day, people were angry. Not at me initially, mostly at the situation. Nobody understood why the turnaround had suddenly changed. Then the HOA board finally told residents about the property dispute. That's when my phone started ringing. Some callers were polite. Others weren't. One woman told me I was hurting innocent families. I asked whether anyone had considered the innocent property owner whose truck had been illegally towed. The line went quiet. Then came Diane. 24 hours after the bollards went up, she stormed across my yard like a woman trying to win an Olympic event for angry walking. She pounded on my front door hard enough to rattle the frame. When I opened it, she didn't even bother saying hello. You need to remove those barriers immediately. I leaned against the doorframe. Good afternoon to you too. Her face turned red. You're creating a safety hazard. Actually, I said, I'm marking my property. That turnaround belongs to the community. No, I replied calmly. It doesn't. Then I handed her the survey. I'll never forget that moment. I watched confidence leave her face in real time. Her eyes moved across the document, then back to the map, then back to the measurements. She wasn't reading unfamiliar information. She was realizing that the information was real. This can't be correct, she said quietly. County records say otherwise. We'll have our attorney review this. You should. She stood there for another few seconds before turning around and walking away. For the first time since I'd known her, Diane looked uncertain. A week later, their attorney finally contacted Martin. The survey had been verified. The encroachment was legitimate. There was no legal challenge available. The land belonged to me. Every day, the situation became more uncomfortable for the HOA. Residents backed into mailboxes. Visitors struggled to turn around. One moving truck blocked the street for nearly 3 hours. Tempers flared. Board meetings became shouting matches. Somebody posted drone footage online showing exactly how much of the turnaround sat on my property. That video spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Then came the incident nobody could ignore. During a community safety exercise organized by the local fire department, a fire truck attempted to navigate the restricted turnaround and got temporarily stuck repositioning itself. Nobody was injured. Nothing was damaged. But residents watched the entire thing happen. Suddenly, this wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a liability. Within 48 hours, the HOA attorney requested a formal meeting. Martin and I sat across from Diane, 2 board members, their attorney, and a property consultant. The mood felt completely different from our earlier interactions. Nobody was issuing demands anymore. Now they were looking for solutions. Their consultant explained the costs of redesigning the road. The numbers were staggering. Permits, engineering studies, construction work, drainage modifications, utility adjustments. The project would likely cost far more than anyone expected. Finally, their attorney looked at me and asked the question everyone knew was coming. Would you consider selling the affected strip of land? I looked at Martin. Martin looked at me. Then I slid a prepared document across the table. Diane picked it up. The color drained from her face almost immediately. The purchase price was listed in large bold numbers. $285,000. The room went silent. One board member actually laughed because he thought it was a joke. It wasn't. Diane finally found her voice. That's outrageous. Martin calmly folded his hands. Then you're welcome to redesign the road. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Eventually, they countered with $40,000. I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. I didn't even react. I simply stood up, thanked everyone for their time, and walked out. Behind me, I could hear people talking over one another as the meeting dissolved into chaos. Outside, the late afternoon sun was dropping behind the trees, and for the first time since my truck had disappeared, I felt completely at peace. Because the reality was simple. They needed that land far more than I needed to sell it. And deep down, every person in that room already knew it. The 3 weeks that followed were probably the longest 3 weeks the HOA board had experienced since that neighborhood was built. For me, life was surprisingly normal. I still woke up before sunrise, poured my coffee into the same old travel mug, walked past the barn, and climbed into my truck parked exactly where it had always been. The difference was that now, every time I drove past the entrance to Oak Hollow Estates, I could practically feel the tension hanging in the air. Residents were frustrated, board members were under pressure, and Diane had gone from acting like the most powerful person in the neighborhood to looking like someone carrying a piano on her back. The complaints kept piling up. Neighbors were arguing during board meetings. Delivery drivers were leaving notes. Visitors were getting confused. One resident backed into another resident's SUV during a rainy evening. A week later, there was another minor fender bender. Nothing serious, but every new incident added fuel to the fire. The situation became impossible to ignore. What really accelerated everything was the financial reality. The board hired engineers to explore redesigning the road. The estimates came back ugly. Every solution involved major construction, permit reviews, utility relocations, and months of disruption. The more they studied alternatives, the more attractive my offer became. Ironically, the number they had originally called ridiculous started looking cheaper by the day. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I didn't call residents. I didn't post online. I didn't give interviews. I didn't stand at the property line celebrating. The truth was, I wasn't trying to punish the neighborhood. Most of those families had never done anything wrong to me. My issue had always been with the people who believed they could exercise authority over property they didn't own. The residents were simply caught in the consequences of decisions made by others. One evening, Martin called me while I was repairing a gate hinge. His first words were, "I think they're ready." The next morning we met again. This time the atmosphere was completely different from the first negotiation. There was no outrage, no laughter, no accusations. Just exhaustion. Diane looked 10 years older than she had a month earlier. Their attorney opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "The board has voted to proceed." Martin reviewed the paperwork. Then he handed it to me. The purchase price was exactly what I had requested, $285,000. In addition, they agreed to reimburse the $380 I had paid to recover my truck. They also agreed to cover $12,000 in legal expenses. Nobody argued. Nobody negotiated. Nobody complained. The fight had left the room. Diane sat quietly while the documents were finalized. At one point, she looked across the table and said something I genuinely didn't expect. "This all started because of that truck, didn't it?" I looked at her for a moment. "No," I said. "It started because somebody forgot where the property line was." For a second, I thought she might argue. Instead, she simply nodded. Maybe for the first time, she understood what I had been trying to say all along. A few weeks later, the transaction officially closed. The deed was recorded. Ownership of the strip transferred. Construction crews removed the bollards. The cul-de-sac functioned normally again. School buses turned around without issue. Delivery vans resumed their routes. Life inside the neighborhood returned to what most people would probably describe as ordinary. But something else changed too. Word spread, not just through the subdivision, but throughout the county. Contractors heard about it. Realtors heard about it. Surveyors definitely heard about it. The story became one of those local legends people bring up during conversations about property rights and HOA overreach. Every version got a little bigger than the last. Some people claimed the HOA nearly went bankrupt. Others swore emergency vehicles were trapped for days. One guy at a hardware store told me he heard the board president resigned and moved to Florida. As far as I know, that one wasn't true. Small-town stories have a way of growing legs. The reality was dramatic enough without the exaggerations. A homeowners association had authorized towing a vehicle from land they didn't own. That decision triggered a survey. The survey uncovered a 15-year-old mistake. The mistake ultimately cost them nearly $300,000. Nobody could have predicted that chain of events, least of all the people who started it. Every now and then I still see some of the residents. Most are friendly. A few have actually thanked me because the incident forced the HOA to become far more careful about how it exercised authority. New board members were elected. Procedures changed. Legal reviews became mandatory before major enforcement actions. In a strange way, the entire community learned something from the experience. As for Diane, our last real conversation happened several months after everything was settled. We crossed paths at a local diner. She approached my table, hesitated for a second, then said, "You know, I never thought any of this would happen." I smiled. Neither did I. She laughed softly, shook her head, and walked away. That was it. No dramatic ending. No final argument. Just two people recognizing how a series of bad decisions had snowballed into something much larger than either of us expected. These days, every morning still starts the same way. I walk outside, coffee in hand, and look across my property. The barn is still there. The gravel pad is still there. And my truck still sits in the exact same spot where it sat before any of this happened. The only difference is that now nobody questions whether it belongs there. Sometimes I'll glance toward the neighborhood behind me and think about how close the whole thing came to being avoided. If somebody had simply knocked on my door before calling a towing company, if somebody had spent 5 minutes checking a survey, if somebody had respected a property line instead of assuming ownership, none of it would have happened. Then again, if they had done that, I probably wouldn't have learned one of the most valuable lessons of my life. Boundaries matter, not just fences and survey markers, but boundaries between authority and arrogance, between leadership and control, between asking and demanding. Once people stop respecting those lines, problems have a way of getting expensive. So now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far when I installed those bollards? Or was the HOA entirely responsible for the situation they created? If you had been in my position, would you have sold the land for less? Or would you have held out for every dollar? Let me know down in the comments because I read every one of them. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or a neighbor who forgot where the boundary line was, I'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for more stories where karma has a funny way of finding the right address.